morning. Thank you for joining us for Creating Excellence. And please let me introduce Vice Chancellor Douglas Haynes.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. Good afternoon on this Southern California day. I want to welcome you to Creating Excellence. I hope that you will enjoy this opportunity to hear about the work generated by 5 of our Chancellor's Inclusive Excellence Awardees, as well as meet our incoming faculty recipients later in the program. While the excellence talks this afternoon that you'll hear will be brief and modeled on the TEDx format, I hope that their remarks will tempt you to engage more broadly in the activities of these scholars, as well as join us in future Office of Inclusive Excellence activities. Before I introduce Chancellor Howard Gilman, I want to take another moment to recognize individuals who have played substantial roles to ensure that we have opportunities to elevate inclusive excellence as an institutional imperative. First, I want to recognize the work of Vice Provost Susan Carlson, whose development and extension of the Advancing Faculty Development Program at the UC Office of the President has provided vital and indeed indispensable support to help diversify the professoriate across the 10-campus system. At UCI, our deans also played substantial roles in nominating scholars and partially funding these important awards. I appreciate their ongoing vision and support, not only to create opportunities to recognize distinguished scholars, but also to equip these new faculty members with important resources to advance their expertise. Finally, and by way of introduction, I want to recognize Chancellor Gilman and his unwavering support to establish this noteworthy award at UCI. When I first approached him to discuss this idea, he was more than supportive. The Chancellor regarded this award program as a powerful lever for mobilizing distinguished scholars from across the country and in the world who share a common audacious vision for transforming the landscape of higher education. Indeed, the recipients of this award will set a new standard as much for the country as for the campus. Chancellor Gilman joins us to present remarks, and in a way that is typical of an award-winning scholar and renowned educator as he is. He reminds me to be brief, so I will simply add that under his leadership, our 6th Chancellor of UCI has set an impressive record in increasing this campus ascendancy among preeminent research universities and establishing UCI as a first-choice university for engaging study, work, and learning. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Howard Gilman.
Thank you so much, Doug, for those overly generous remarks. Thank you for your tremendous leadership of these efforts. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm so delighted to join you at this first Chancellor's Inclusive Excellence Awardees Forum. So UCI has received 5 advancing faculty diversity grants in a range of areas that included advancing STEM faculty diversity, promoting networked mentoring, elevating best practices in the physical sciences faculty recruitment. Our current initiative celebrated through the Creating Excellence Forum to recognize and build scholarly capacities for inclusive excellence, and an award received last year to examine components of UCI-wide mentoring. These awards recognize the breadth of our efforts and commitments, and we acknowledge these awards knowing that the work they highlight is complemented by a broad range of other efforts across the campus that are designed to expand pathways to the professorate and provide a range of family-friendly and supportive grants for diverse faculty and student thriving. Some of you know that today's forum has its roots in the UCI Advance program, now celebrating its 20th anniversary. As many of you know, UCI Advance was originally supported by a National Science Foundation grant in 2001. Over the years, it has grown into an institutionalized faculty peer model which has been adapted across other UC campuses. It also supports additional models for equity and diversity in graduate studies through decade mentors. And we're also very happy about a current pilot program for staff equity fellows in partnership with the divisions of Student Affairs, Finance and Administration, and Information Technology. In other words, let us not rest on our laurels. Each step should be considered a toehold that allows us to achieve at even higher levels across all aspects of our mission. UCI Advance, along with many other efforts, have resulted in a year-to-date total of 35 faculty hires, 85% of whom are women and 57% of whom are from historically underrepresented racial or ethnic backgrounds. This builds on other successes we've had over a number of years. But friends, make no mistake, there's nothing automatic about these results. We will only continue to make progress in building a more inclusive university community if all of us take ongoing responsibility for interrogating our practices so that we might make real our commitment to recognize, support, and nurture the talent of all people, especially those who historically have been overlooked, marginalized, and oppressed. You know, the official motto of the University of California is Fiat Lux, let there be light. So let us use this occasion to reaffirm our commitment to finding the light that shines bright in all people of goodwill who aspire to make contributions within our scholarly community. Let me close these brief remarks by congratulating the 5 scholars whose original work we recognize today. Their scholarship ranges across the academic landscape, from law to education to informatics to nursing, and reflects the intellectual diversity of a great research university. Like you, I'm looking forward to their talks. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Chancellor Gilman. I appreciate your support and participation in this forum on creating excellence. It is now my pleasure to introduce 5 of our newest faculty members at UCI who will be presenting talks to you today that help answer the question, why does inclusive excellence matter in my work at UCI? The event program at our website provides their biographical sketches, but allow me to highlight their research interests for you now. Professor Julie Washington joined UCI's School of Education in January 2021 after serving as chair and professor at Georgia State University. At UCI, she directs the UCI Learning Disabilities Research Innovation Hub and the Dialect, Poverty, and Academic Success Lab, with a focus on the intersection of literacy, language, and poverty. Professor Washington will present on Opportunity Starts Here. Before her presentation, we'll hear from 3 faculty members looking at unique aspects of inclusion. Professor Anne-Marie Piper is in the Department of Informatics at the Donald Brent School of Information and Computer Sciences. She will present about creating inclusive digital futures for aging and disability, informing us about her research in human-computer interactions to create more equitable and inclusive experiences. Professor Gustavo Carlo joined UCI after serving as the Millsap Professor of Diversity and Multicultural Studies in the Department of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Missouri. He presents on a recipe for raising bien equidado kids, highlighting his research on pro-social development in culturally diverse children and adolescents. Professor Don Bounds joined the Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing after serving on the faculty in nursing and in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Rush University in Chicago. Professor Bounds will present on projects for deciphering adversity by creating ripples, the development of grit with the next gen of healthcare providers, to discuss her research on risks and resilience of youth with socially complex needs. Our first presenter is Professor Cindy Archer, is a professor of lawyering skills at the UCI School of Law and formerly served in both administrator and faculty roles for more than 20 years at Loyola Law School. She presents today about how lawyers trained for inclusive excellence provide access, to highlight her research interests in experiential legal education and the professional responsibilities of lawyers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cindy Archer.
Thank you, Vice Provost Haynes, and thank you, Chancellor Gilman. So my work centers on integrating the science behind mitigation of implicit biases, cognitive learning theories into legal pedagogy with the hope, as my title notes, that access to justice in the legal system. A recognition requires more than dismantling unjust laws, but training lawyers in inclusive excellence. And joining a faculty like that at UCI with an emphasis on interdisciplinary learning and innovative education allows me to really have the resources to explore this approach. Not to belabor the points, but recent protests around the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others have highlighted the need for reform in our legal system. But these calls for reform usually call for thoughts about changing actual laws and policies. And what sometimes gets overlooked in legal education is the impact of human lawyer decision-making on access to justice. Even if our laws were to attain what many look for as neutralities or dismantling what is reflected in systemic racism, the biases inherent in lawyer counseling and decision-making would still significantly impact access to justice. A short but prime example of this was a study that was published in 2012 by Boucher, Cohen, and Lawless, wherein they studied the advice given by bankruptcy lawyers. And holding everything else constant, this research showed that the lawyers disproportionately, at almost twice the rate, suggested to their Black clients Chapter 13 bankruptcy, and to their white clients Chapter 7. And you don't have to be a lawyer to understand the impact of this example. Chapter 13 bankruptcy is significantly more costly and more onerous. And in this study, everything else being constant, the same lawyers suggested the more onerous practice for their Black clients. So for me, the important thing is thinking about not solely changing the law, but what can we do in legal education to help lawyers recognize and manage these biases. So focusing on and trying to simplify the science behind mitigation of bias, two of the major requirements are opportunities for reflection. Reflection on the assumptions that are made, reflection on the impetus for the implicit associations that most people make. And then secondarily, the science says that this must be taught in context and where there are realistic opportunities for decision-making. Most of the courses that I teach as a professor of law and skills are simulation courses. And what I have found over the years is following the studies, these are the types of courses wherein you can have the greatest impact because they provide realistic scenarios in which lawyers can work, but because they're simulations, the pacing of the course is such that there's the opportunity for reflection. Examples of some of the types of exercises that I've been able to use in my classes, which are most effective. And one of the things I want to continue to look at is how to evaluate the effectiveness of this beyond just evaluations from students is, for instance, in my simulations, I have students interview a live client, or what I consider to be a live client, hire an actor or ask someone to act out the role of client. So the students can determine how to get information from a client that they're going to research and analyze. But before the students go further to research, I ask the students to stop and answer questions about the client. For instance, is your client an immigrant? Is your client college educated? Did your client grow up in a single family home? And none of the facts I gave them allowed them to answer those questions. So most of them look at me with a blank stare, but I forced them to write down the answers to those questions. Then after I ensure everyone has done so, I asked them, what is it that allowed you to answer that question? I don't want to know your answer, but what is it that allows you to do so? And in that moment, we're able to talk about implicit associations that our brain makes, right? And that's something that's not controlled, that's subconscious. But then more importantly, we're able to pause and reflect on the question of how would the answers to those questions impact the advice, the decisions you might make on what remedies are available to your client, on what would be a better route given the legal analysis. Another similar example is I usually give my client a situation wherein they're helping a client for which, a client who has been harmed, for which a remedy should be available in what one might consider criminal context. And one of the scenarios that is usually generated is, oh, my client, has it called the police. They haven't considered using law enforcement. And in that discussion, I always ask the question, well, if your client is uncomfortable, what if there's something in your client's past interactions with the police that they feel like that's not a viable option for them to use that resource? If that sort of question is counter to a lawyer's values, they may dismiss the client's goals, dismiss what is important to the client, and making a determination on the best route. And again, in a simulation course where the student is confronted with realistic decisions, they're able, with the pacing that we're able to include, we can work through and help them practice mitigating the implicit bias and associations that come about. So I'm excited, even though this has been a passion of mine for some years, I'm excited that this grant is giving me the opportunity to not only do further study in cognitive transition of the lessons that my students learn, but to build resources that will be able to be used not only at UCI, but at other law schools to ensure this training for young lawyers, which I believe will provide further access to justice for clients on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Archer. Please welcome Professor Dawn Bounds.
Thank you. So my presentation today is entitled Deciphering Adversity by Creating Ripples: The Development of Grit with the Next Gen of Healthcare Providers. I'd like to start by saying adversity is inevitable. Life is going to happen. But some populations are exposed to more adversity than others. Despite this, there are strategies to cope with and overcome adversity. And overcoming adversity is important because we know that trauma and adversity makes us sick. Not just emotionally unwell, but physically unwell. Adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, has been connected to significant increases in risks for suicide, substance use, cardiovascular disease. The list goes on and on and on. But ACEs doesn't have to be a death sentence. Creating buffering protective factors or balancing the scale towards resilience can decrease the risks associated with adversity and toxic stress. Healthcare providers can help their patients develop resilience by supporting their self-care habits, making referrals to mental health, and promoting positive parenting. In fact, California Surgeon General Nadine Burke-Harris has started a movement where she is encouraging healthcare providers to screen for ACEs universally so that they can identify, or so that we can identify patients at risk for toxic stress and that we intervene appropriately. The next gen of healthcare providers are the perfect group of people to propel these efforts forward. But you have to start at the source, which is why the Cypher Lab was born. Cypher, or Centering Youth and Families for Empowerment and Resilience, recruited a diverse group of UCI students who expressed interest in working with families in the community as health coaches. We intentionally encourage students to apply from populations that we know are more likely to experience adversity. These include ethnic racial minorities, first-generation college students, those raised by single parents. And immediately, UCI students reached out to me and not only expressed interest, but shared the adversities that they were currently experiencing or that they had experienced in the past. We know that as healthcare providers, we don't come to this work without our own backgrounds, histories, traumas, and adversities. So we must start by going beneath the surface, by teaching our students how to manage their own stress and take care of themselves. We teach them how to develop their own buffering protective factors, as well as exploring the damage structural violence, implicit bias, etc., has on healthcare delivery, and our own lives. So supporting the next gen of healthcare providers started with our students developing their own self-care practices and then progressed into training them to become health coaches so that they can then go on to support youth and families in the community using an intervention we developed called GRIT. GRIT stands for Garnering Resilience and Traumatized Youth and Families. And in GRIT, we leverage technology to measure toxic stress and track self-care practices. I actually have on a cool Oura ring today that tracks things like heart rate variability, which has been an objective measure of stress. It also tracks sleeping patterns, my steps for the day. It's pretty amazing. In addition to leveraging technology, GRIT includes 8 health coaching sessions modeled after the Surgeon General's Guide to Prevent Toxic Stress. The guide focuses on 7 stress busters. First and foremost, supportive relationships. Second, quality sleep. Third, balanced nutrition. Fourth, physical activity. 5, mindful practices. 6, experiencing nature. And 7th, mental health care. In addition to the 8 health coaching sessions, we will conduct 3 assessments/boosters. In addition to collecting objective data and self-report data, we will be reinforcing these stress busters and problem-solving barriers to self-care practice at those boosters. My hope is that GRIT can be used to guide youth and their families who are at risk for toxic stress towards increasing their buffering protective factors, disrupting the transmission of intergenerational trauma and stress. Because we know life will happen. We will experience adversity, and parents will transmit that stress to their children. But the story does not have to end there. We can overcome the impact of adversity and subsequent toxic stress. But we must start at the source by supporting parents, building resilience in our youth, and preparing the next gen of healthcare providers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bounds. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gustavo Carlo.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Divisiveness in our society speaks loudly to the importance of finding ways to promote and foster peace, harmony amongst individuals and between individuals and groups of different backgrounds. Beyond the importance of finding ways to foster these characteristics, we need to also think about how we can break the cycle, the intergenerational cycle of intergroup violence in our communities. And that really requires us to think about how we can intervene and teach our children to be more pro-social, to be more moral, and to be more good. When I was a small boy in San Juan, Puerto Rico, growing up in San Juan, Puerto Rico, my mom used to pull me aside sometimes when I would, once in a while do something that I wasn't supposed to do. And she would talk to me about the importance of me growing up to be what she termed a bien educado child, or a well-educated child. But the term bien educado doesn't really refer to a formal education. It really refers to the idea in many Latina families that children should grow up to be well-mannered, well considerate, respectful, kind, and nice towards other people. And everybody, in fact, probably hopes that their kid grows up to be a good moral kid. In our field, in this field that I have spent the last several decades studying, we called this form of characteristic or behavior pro-social behavior. Refers to positive social behaviors. Pro-social behaviors are things like sharing and being kind to others, donating, volunteerism. And it actually forms the basis for positive interpersonal relationships of all kinds. Intimate relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, and so on. It also forms the basis for morality. When we think about moral exemplars or individuals who exemplify great moral characteristics, we often think of those individuals on the basis of the pro-social behaviors that they engaged in. But one thing is to hope that our kids grow up to be pro-social, and another thing is for us to be active in trying to promote and raise our children to be pro-social or bien educado. And over the past 3 decades or so, our research teams have really devoted our energy and efforts to try to understand what are the different predictors of pro-social development in children and adolescents. And in one of our lines, we focused on parenting. And I want to sort of provide a little summary recipe, so to speak, about what we've learned in terms of how parents, and Latino parents in particular, raise their children to be pro-social. So you start out with a good dose of moral values, things like honesty, and fairness, and kindness, and niceness. You add a couple of tablespoons of good parenting practices. And we have found that, for example, parents who reward their kids for being good by giving them social rewards, such as praise and love and affection, that tends to actually foster pro-sociality in their kids. And in fact, it's much more effective than the use of material rewards, which many parents often use, such as giving them money or giving them a treat for being nice or doing something good. So we have found that the use of social rewards, in contrast to the use of material rewards, is much more effective at that. Another good parenting practice that we have found to be that fosters pro-sociality in kids is when kids do something wrong, that they discipline them by using what we call inductions, parental inductions. And inductions are simply talking to your kids and trying to make them understand why what they did was wrong. And in fact, if you use what we call role-taking inductions, which is trying to induce your child to think about what the consequences of their actions were on other people, that can foster empathy for that other child. And in the end, that can foster prosociality. So once you have the values, and once you have some parenting practices, you also want to sprinkle in a little bit of empathy. So you want to do things that encourage your children to express sadness instead of discouraging their expression of sadness. You want them to also think about these sorts of situations where they have opportunities to help others and foster reasoning or thinking about those situations, and maybe talk to them about why they did or did not help that other person that needed help in that situation. And then you want to take these ingredients and store them in a nice, nurturing, positive home environment with minimal stress and minimal family conflict. And importantly, when we're talking about Latina children in particular, but also children from other ethnic racial minority groups, we also want to protect them and shelter them from experiences of discrimination and cultural stress. And of course, that's very difficult to do because those stressors can come at children from all kinds of different directions. And so even if we can't shelter them or protect them from it, we could at least sort of talk to them and help them cope with those discriminatory experiences. We have found, in fact, in our research, that discrimination actually undermines prosociality in children. So we live in a time where we need to find ways to reduce intergroup conflict and to foster social inclusivity in our communities. And I think that really requires us to be conscious about how we are raising our children. It requires parents to be invested and engaged in raising their children, to be pro-social. We've learned a lot about how Latino families are doing it. But we also, in our lab, in our research, we also study these processes in other cultures, including in majority white European American families. In the end, we can learn from studying these different processes in different cultures about how we can raise all of our children to be pro-social. We can learn from each other about how children from different backgrounds can learn to get along with each other, cooperate, and together improve the quality of life for all. We all have the same goal, and that is to raise our children to be pro-social, or as my mom used to say, bien educado. Our work at UCI is focused on growing that understanding and pursuing that understanding, how we can foster prosociality and bien educado kids across different contexts and across different cultures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Carlo. Please welcome Anne-Marie Piper.
We are more than a year into a global pandemic. And if this experience has taught us anything, it's that we crave human connection. We've been isolated from bubbles, using whatever technology is at our fingertips to stay connected and care for others who are at a distance. And staying connected has been hard for everyone, but it has been especially difficult for many older adults and people with disabilities. My work examines how we can make technology accessible so that people can stay connected and socially engaged throughout the lifespan. What I've learned over the past decade of work is that we are drastically underprepared for what it means to age online. I'm an ethnographer of technology, aging, and disability. So today I'll share a brief story from my fieldwork that happened long before the pandemic began. This is a story about Alice, and she's a woman in her 80s. And Alice keeps herself busy with her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. But she also cares for her husband, John, who has progressive dementia. In addition to helping to feed, bathe, and transport John, Alice now experiences a new form of caregiving work, the work of keeping John connected and safe online. Now, John was active online throughout the early stages of dementia, and at one point he placed order after order for the same item, accumulating significant credit card bills. Plus, he would post on Facebook, sometimes private details that it's not clear he should be sharing. So Alice stepped in and took away John's credit card, but she still wants him to stay connected with people online. Others in my field work said that even after identity theft, they still help their loved ones go online. It's that important. When Alice's husband passed away, it took months for Alice to disentangle the labyrinth of online information that John had created over the years. So Alice was prepared financially and physically for John's passing, but she was significantly underprepared for managing his digital footprint after he passed away. And this story is all too common in my research, and maybe you've experienced parts of it yourself already. So given what happened with her husband, Alice asks her children, her adult children, to check in on her regularly to make sure what she's doing online is okay. But she has to use workarounds like sharing passwords because our online systems don't support the interdependent nature of life as we all age. As Alice's experience illustrates, it's crucial that we rethink the design of our online systems to support a diversity of experiences and our changing abilities throughout the lifespan. Every new project I work on points to the same thing. We've all felt it over this past year. We want meaningful ways to connect with and care for others at a distance. Now, we've had more than 2 decades worth of research on the smart home of the future and remote caregiving technologies. Yet when faced with a global pandemic, we see that we are still drastically underprepared for making that future happen. But if we can design technology, inclusive technology with these human experiences in mind, we can start to create a world that supports lifelong connection, inclusion, and well-being. Along with my colleagues in informatics, I assure you we are working hard on these issues. For example, UCI's newly launched Steckler Center for Responsible, Ethical, and Accessible Technology, or the CREATE Center, is key to making this future happen. There are so many tools at our fingertips. Another older adult in my research said that during the pandemic, FaceTime is my lifeline. I'd be dead without it. For someone who is home alone and isolated during the pandemic, the tools that keep us connected are a lifeline. But these very same tools raise new challenges of ethics when artificial intelligence seeps into each and every interaction we have online and in person. So how can we use technology to bring about greater human connection, but do so in a responsible, ethical, and accessible way? My colleagues and I are not just studying what technology currently is. We are inventing new technologies to enable inclusive online experiences for people of all ages and abilities. For example, we created the Moments system. Moments allows people with dementia to use physical objects like postcards and photographs to communicate with their loved ones at a distance. A person with dementia may no longer understand what it means to send an email or post online to social media, but they can use familiar physical objects to initiate digital connections with family and friends at a distance. But our work here is far from complete. Consider for a moment, 1 in 3 older people die with Alzheimer's disease or another dementia. It is a key part of what we're doing to change that. And part of that is happening currently through UCI informatics doctoral student, Gisette Johnson. She has fascinating results on what it means for people with dementia to stay active online, to give and receive support to others. People with dementia are leading their own support groups and setting their own agenda for life online. In yet another project, we spent several years working with older adults who are blind or low vision. These individuals want to stay connected, but using a computer and accessibility software can present insurmountable challenges. Many people with late life vision loss stop using computers altogether and switch to phone calls instead. So learning from this, we created Express, which is an online community that allows blind and low vision older adults to call in using a landline phone or any type of cell phone and create and listen to audio recorded blog posts. And what we found was incredible. People were calling in to share stories about community events. They were exchanging information about accessible voting locations. And they even rallied around one member who was coming to terms with no longer being able to drive. Community, access, and inclusion. This is why we're doing all of this work. So I'll close today with the same question that I always ask my students. What is the digital future you want for yourself, your parents, and your children as we all age online? And your vision of that future is exactly where we should be investing our time and resources today. Inclusive design is going to help us be more prepared for the future we all want and need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Piper. I'll remind participants that we'll have a Q&A after, so please feel free to issue your questions in the Q&A function. And please join me in welcoming Professor Julie Washington.
Thank you. Inclusive excellence is about recognizing, valuing, and including diverse students. My research focuses on how to get these students, in particular African-American students, to the university by improving academic outcomes and educational access. Then once they are here, how to prepare them for the places that they can and should go from here. There's a highly referenced opportunity gap in our education system, both public and private. There have been many variables implicated in this gap. We know, for example, that the more resources and support that you have, the better you will fare in our educational systems. But the structural barriers that we have created for children, their parents, and communities mean that there will be many missed opportunities for universities who are committed to inclusive excellence. Which students are the brightest and the best? Do we have access to them? Or alternatively, have we developed a system where they have no access to us or opportunity to enter? I've been working for the past couple of years with a private tuition-free school for children and families experiencing homelessness. This is a population that we have had little success with because they don't come to school. But this school, simply by opening as a private school, removed a significant barrier to school access for these families, an address. We started with preschool and we add a grade every year. We're up to first grade, and more than 90% of students who started in preschool are still enrolled and show up for school. There's a waiting list because homeless families have learned that no matter where they live or don't live, their children will have a school, teachers, and friends who welcome and care about them. We removed a structural barrier, and now the brightest, best, and homeless have access to a high-quality education that may allow us to include them here. Once we graduate these students and they make it to UCI, they have reached the place that they worked so hard for, and they have made it, correct? Well, it depends upon where they want to go from here, as we too have created structural barriers that may prevent them from going to the places they want to go or should go and don't even know it yet. I've served on several committees at the National Institutes of Health in my career. More and more, I am seeing a standard for student funding that depends upon a demonstrated history of interest in research. These are students who have been working in someone's lab in some capacity, often since high school, because they had access and opportunity to these resources. When and where does this happen for minority students if we don't create that opportunity here? I have a first-generation minority doctoral student who, when I asked her about her path to the university, said, "When I was an undergrad at the community college where I started my college career, I decided I wanted to go to graduate school and get a PhD so that I could come back and teach students who were like me. But I learned that in order to be competitive, I had to get into a research lab. But in research labs, you work for free, you volunteer, and I had to pay my rent and eat. I didn't have parents supporting me financially. So when I finished, I couldn't go straight to graduate school because I wasn't competitive. So I took 2 years off, looked for a research lab that would pay me so I could get research experience and still eat. Structural barriers. Inclusive excellence for me at UCI means preparing minority undergrads for graduate, that is doctoral study, by using this award to provide an opportunities, paid opportunities to gain the experience and knowledge that allows Black and Brown students to go where they want to go next. Otherwise, their ability to compete beyond their time with us is negatively impacted. We have promised our students growing up in poverty that their college education will provide more opportunities for them. We need to be sure to keep our promises. Creating opportunities and inclusive excellence means reaching back, as far back as needed, identifying and removing barriers for our brightest, best, and frequently most vulnerable students. And then, when we finally get them here, providing the support, both scholarly and financial, that they need to prepare them for the places that they can and should go from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Washington. And I want to extend a very warm welcome and thanks to all of our panelists. I have to say that your presentations, and I'm sure the audience would agree, were particularly compelling. They were compelling to me because they really illuminated how our research can advance inclusive excellence through a greater sense of empathy. And in each of your ways, you commented on how your research, how you're deploying your Inclusive Excellence Awards to really produce research, but also educational experiences for our remarkable students. That is just so important and a very powerful example for all of us to learn from. Now, what I'd like to do is to pivot to questions. And I want to revisit a question that I raised at the outset of my remarks. And it has to do with why inclusive excellence matters in these great range of efforts for UCI members. In other words, the question is, how did you come up with these ideas? When exactly did you get these ideas and thoughts about how to execute them? And this is a question that originated from one of our registrants. And so if you can turn on your videos, I invite any one of you to sort of take the plunge and answer this question. How did you come up with these ideas? Were they present when you were a toddler? Did you bump into them? And so I'm going to invite you, Professor Bounds, to sort of weigh in on this question.
Sure. Well, I'll say I definitely didn't come up with it when I was young. It's something that has evolved over time. And as someone who wasn't always presented with opportunities, I found it important on both ends. There were times when I felt excluded, and then there were times when I had wonderful mentors and wonderful opportunities, and I'm very thankful for those. And so in many ways, I felt the need to pay it forward. My work has often been focused on youth in the communities, but as I mentioned before, I know my life history and my experiences, and who's to say that our students don't come with those histories as well. And so many of this has to do with my own modeling and my own practices, and making sure that our students are doing those things so that they can be better prepared to take care of our patients in the community once they graduate.
Thank you, Professor Benz. What's so fascinating about these presentations is that they really describe the intersection of the personal and professional as this really rich dialectic. And I want to invite you, Professor Piper, to weigh in on this question. I'm a child of the 20th century, so I didn't encounter a computer until much later in my educational career. But the idea of aging online takes on renewed meaning. And it's not just waiting to get a callback, but it's actually more substantive. Where did this idea, this research thrust come from?
Well, for me, it's very personal. I have very close personal relationships with a lot of elders in my life. But one thing I didn't mention in my talk was that all of the work we do is community driven. So we are out in the community working with a variety of stakeholders. So older adults themselves living on their own, older adults living in communities, their family members. And the best ideas and the real rich ideas with substance come from the community. But it's also that as a lab and as a research group, we really want to make sure that people with disabilities are given the space and allowed the space to lead innovation. So it's about hiring colleagues with disabilities. It's about hiring and recruiting students with disabilities and making sure that they are the ones who are helping lead and chart this agenda.
Thank you so much. So it's not enough to simply engage in research that advances inclusion. We have to model it in the very research enterprise that constructs the project. Here, I want to turn to Professor Carlo, because you began with this interesting reflection on your childhood. And I'm kind of curious, at what point in your educational career did that experience come back as having this generative value as a research opportunity in question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I too did not come up with this idea when I was that small and having those early childhood experiences. But it is true that that I had subsequent experiences that made me think back to my childhood. And in fact, I think as Dr. Bounds alluded to, one of those was my incredible fortunate experience and opportunity to have run into someone who took me under their wings as a mentor and provided, took this somewhat lost little young man, I should say, I guess, and sort of, woke me to possibilities that I had not ever thought of before. And as we all know, becoming a mentor and really, engaging as a mentor, that mentor-mentee relationship is akin to a parent-child relationship in many ways. And so I thought about it, and I realized that my mentor was really very pro-social, very doing things that going out of his way. These were not things that were built into his responsibilities, or at least not directly, and certainly not for what I felt was other young men or women that he could have chosen to work with. So in that sense, it was a nurturing environment. It was all of the sorts of things that reminded me of the experiences that I had with my mom when I was young. And so eventually that all expanded and generalized beyond parent-child relationships into the idea that these relationships that we nurture and that we create early in the life of kids has these long-term implications and consequences that impact our communities, that impact how we interact with others in our communities, that impact how we interact with each other within institutions like institutions of higher education and in industry and in other arenas of our lives. And so I think the basic mechanisms are applicable across any sort of context, any sort of situation. And these are the most desirable characteristics and what I believe to be the most important characteristics that we need to propagate and to foster to address the major challenges that we're facing in our communities and across the world right now. So,
well, thank you. You know, what I'm hearing is that our lives matter, right? And that part of the educational process is to understand the scale at which they matter. And I can't help but reflect when I was listening to your presentation, Professor Washington, that when I was much younger and had more hair, I received my letter of admissions to college on April 1. Now, this is in the 20th century. And so I got on a dial-up and spoke with the recruiter. And what really mattered to me is when I asked her, I said, "Is this serious?" And she was so patient, in part because she understood who I was. A young first generation person who was trying to understand, how do I get over there from here? And to what extent do mentors and mentoring play such a fundamental part in creating that educational pathway of achievement? Professor Washington.
Well, I think for most of us, that has been really, really important, really central, that someone often saw something in you that you didn't actually see in yourself. Or you saw things in yourself that were positive and would get you to one place, but didn't actually have the experiences in your life to see that there was something beyond that place where you could go. I know for myself, I'm really committed to mentoring both students and faculty because I had great mentors and people who along the way made me aware of things that weren't even on my radar. I feel like more than half the opportunities that I got in my life as a young person were either accidental, unintentional, or divine providence. I don't know how you would describe it, but they definitely weren't me going after something, but it was someone seeing that this was something that I might benefit from and could succeed at and encouraged me to do it. And so I know that a lot of times when we have students come in, we think that students are going to go out and seek opportunities, but you can't seek what you don't know exists, or you can't seek what you don't know is available to you. And so I feel like as a mentor, because it happened for me, that part of my job as a mentor is to open students' opportunities and their eyes up to the opportunities that exist for them that they might not have even thought about or known about. And so I think that's a big part of what we do, especially for students who come from backgrounds where they may be the first one who's ever done this. And so mentors are really critical, and almost all of us do me search, not just research. It's about who we were, where we came from, and wanting to extend that opportunity and more to others.
Wow. Thank you. I want to encourage members of the audience to use the question and answer feature to share your questions and comments for the panelists. But in the meantime, I want to ask a question from another participant. And it really has to do with where we are now in the midst of a pandemic that has simultaneously revealed and created disparities created this collective experience that often is familiar, but in some ways very different depending on where you are in the sort of the social landscape. And the question asks, what do you see as the most critical challenges to diversity and inclusivity at UCI and beyond? And so it's a fairly, modest question, but I think it's such an important question because in some sense, underlying it is the idea, are we different now? Will we be different when we quote unquote return to campus? What are the challenges as we pivot to that point to diversity and inclusivity? And I want to invite Professor Piper to weigh in if you're willing.
Sure, I'm thinking through this, and it's thinking from my own perspective. I'm focused on aging a lot, and the gaps in online participation I see among the older adult demographic, where we can think about even just a few years ago, a third of older Americans were still offline, and that those who were offline tended to fall along the lines of the oldest old, lower income, less well educated. And I sort of see that, that kind of gap widening over this past year. Those who've done well and stayed connected, have managed and made it through, and others have really, it's taken a toll. And I kind of think through that a lot as I'm thinking through our students, our undergraduates, but also K through 12 students, those who have had the resources and the support and the tech know-how to make all of this work over the past year, may have even seen gains, right? Whereas so many are not in that situation. I think that's kind of how I relate my own work to what's happening with diversity and inclusion in the context of the pandemic, and will things be the same? I think we're going to see major gaps, and we don't even know what those gaps are yet, and major issues of equity. And I think it's up to us to all be vigilant of that and continue both studying it and talking about it with our students and our colleagues.
Thank you. I want to reach out to Professor Archer. And I was quite struck by your presentation about the importance of setting the context for learning in terms of lawyering skills. And you use the example of bankruptcy, the differential advice to give to folks. And I'm really interested in how you see the challenges for diversity and inclusivity as we move out of the current crisis. How will it affect or not the landscape of justice in the civil and the criminal realm, as well as issues around financial equity?
Yeah, coming out of going into pandemic, one thing I will say I noted, I still remember March 16th last year. At that point, I was still an administrator, and we were told we're going to be online, and we've got to move classes, and I was trying to move things and thinking about just from the educational perspective. And as many people have pointed out, as a result of where we are now, what it did was really just highlight inequities. It didn't maybe create as many more, and I realized the number of students who were accessing books on their phone, right? Because they didn't have a computer, or the number of, I supported our clinical programs, and everyone went online, and we had clients who had hearings who had no access to a computer. So the thought that, oh, we'll just move everything online is not a reality for everyone. Yeah. It's not a reality for so many of the people who lawyers were trying to serve, in that context, and to try to, in legal education, help students understand it's not the textbook case that they come in with. All of them want to create change and make change, but for most of the people who are going to be served, the pandemic and all we've gone through have just emphasized the lack of access and the inequities that are there. When I think about even what has happened again with the protests around the election and protests for change, many of our students were traumatized in those moments in terms of thinking about access again to justice. They were traumatized themselves, but the people that we were serving were not just challenged, but traumatized by a lot of what they saw. And that for me, again, brings a question of access, right? Every time there's one more moment of challenge and distrust, there's less people who are going to try to access the justice system. And how do we prepare young lawyers to deal not just with the law and the things they struggle with in a theoretical realm, but how do we get them to deal with people who have mistrust and who've been traumatized by so many things? That's one of the real challenges in educating young professionals today, is the inability to serve the whole person and what people have experienced during this time period.
And I'd like to use to ask a follow-up question, because I learned recently that the School of Law, that the faculty voted to create a new graduation requirement that now mandates that law students, before they graduate, need to complete a course that addresses race and indigeneity. And to what extent do you think this is a requirement that will help prepare our terrific law students, but in particular prepare them for this familiar but new world that we're going to be entering to once we get through the immediate crisis of the pandemic?
It's a first step, but I'm so very excited about this requirement for two main reasons. One, the course that students are required to take has to center on not only the current impact, but the historical, right? The historical foundation of the inequities in our system. And on the one hand, for students who have been impacted by these inequities most of their life, no one's ever given voice to that. You go into law school and you think, I'm going to go to law school, I'm going to learn how to address these. And then you hear nothing about those inequities, or you hear it on a limited basis, or you hear it depending on if you in particular decided to take a race in the law class. But if you didn't, oftentimes you just hear about contract law. So I think one, it's going to provide inclusivity for students who come to law school and say, oh, wow, somebody's paying attention to what I've been experiencing. But for the students as a whole, it's going to give them such a different lens to not only learn the law, but what's important for law students is to critique the law, to judge it, and not just to accept it as it is. You can't make change if you're not able to critique. And I think this requirement is going to force young legal professionals to actually step back and have a true lens through which to critique the law. And that will give them such a greater foundation for change than learning the status quo.
It's interesting. I really appreciate those observations. Jan Fisher has an interesting question that I will just formulate more as a what if, integrating pro-social behaviors in legal education that Professor Carlo mentioned. But I want to circle back to the question about what next. What are the challenges for diversity and inclusivity? And unfortunately, this will be our final question. And I want to ask Professor Bounds to consider this in light of where you're situated at the Henry and Susan Samueli College of Health Sciences and the Gross School of Nursing. That, if I'm not mistaken, I think that the future will certainly involve healthcare and health equity, hopefully in new ways.
Absolutely. It's definitely what's been on my mind as we have been exploring this discussion, particularly given that we are educating both pre-licensure nurses as well as nurses who are currently on the front lines of overlapping crises, the pandemic, and taking care of patients and being witness to a tremendous amount of collective trauma, grief, and loss. And so I do think that things will never be the same. I do think that how one nurse experiences it and may or may not have the resources to deal with a tremendous amount of imbalance in what it means to be a nurse on the front lines in this time is significant. And I think we're just beginning to consider that impact. And in particular, consider how many nurses are deciding to leave the field. And I think they're leaving due to us not really being prepared to deal with these inequities that they are currently experiencing.
Wow. I want to extend my thanks to each of you for providing this remarkable set of perspectives about why inclusive excellence matters to your work. I think you really represent the very best of this program, the Chancellor's Inclusive Excellence Award Program. And I have to say, you've exceeded our wildest expectations. And I just want to add that your presence, your research, your teaching commitment, your service is so needed now, particularly as our campus, our country, and our world copes and summons the will to create a better society once we get through this. And so finally, I'd like to pivot to our final segment this afternoon. Again, I want to thank all of our presenters for their insightful talks. I think it's true to say they've whetted our appetites to learn more and to hear about future progress and applications of their work. But before I close today, I am pleased to welcome our newest Inclusive Excellence Awardees. These faculty members will join UCI this July 2021, and we look forward to hearing their presentations at next year's forum. Professor Alexandra Floria will join the Department of Mathematics from serving as the RIT Assistant Professor at Columbia University to pursue her research in analytic number theory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Floria, and I invite her to share her insights about the meaning of the Inclusive Excellence Award for her work. Professor Floria?
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. And first, I just want to thank the speakers for their important work and for their presentations. I'm joining UCI this summer, and the focus of my work at UCI will be on women in math, which is something that I became involved in during my graduate studies and during my postdoctoral studies. At UCI, as an immigrant from a developing country, I'm also interested in the intersection of gender, social class, and immigration background. So these are some things that I'm interested in pursuing. And I think there are plenty of good opportunities to foster diversity in these areas. And I thank the university for supporting my involvement in them. And I'm looking forward to joining the math department this summer.
Terrific. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce incoming assistant professor in the School of Law, Jamila Morgan. Professor Morgan examines the intersections of the race, gender, and disability, criminal law, and punishment. She has served as a civil rights litigator and as a faculty at the University of Connecticut. Please join me in welcoming Professor Morgan, and I invite her to share her brief insights with us as well about the award. Professor Morgan.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Haynes, and thank you for this tremendous honor. It is a delight to be here. I am so looking forward to joining the School of Law come July. The Inclusive Excellence Award will support my ongoing research at issues or examining issues at the intersection of race, disability, policing, criminal law, and punishment. And I believe that through this work, there are ways to surface both possibilities for using law to reduce some of the ongoing harms and inequalities that impact low-income communities of color, and also develop opportunities for law students to work on behalf of these communities and alongside these communities. So to echo so much of what my future colleague Cindy Archer said, this is an incredible opportunity to train new law students to tackle issues pertaining to social justice. And for me, someone that grew up in LA County, it's a wonderful opportunity to return home and work for an incredible institution in particular at the law school, working on these issues. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Morgan, and welcome again. I'm pleased to welcome Tiara Naputi, who will join us as an assistant professor in the Department of Global and International Studies in the School of Social Sciences. We hope that the Chancellor's Inclusive Excellence Award will support our research on the indigenous Chamorro people of Guam. Thank you so much for joining us. Would you share some insights with us about your reactions to receiving this award?
Sure. Half a day greetings and happy Earth Day to all. I'm really thrilled to be joining the UCI faculty. And I'm looking forward to using the Chancellor's Award to continue to create spaces to address relevant issues of the Indigenous, Asian, Black, and Pacific Islander communities. Of course, many of the members of these communities, myself included, also come from multiple ancestral relations, and those really do connect us in the struggles for social and racial justice. And so I'm hoping to be able to use the award to continue to guide me, especially to advance first generation and Indigenous Pacific peoples like myself in higher education. And I'm really excited to explore the themes of my research on climate change, sustainability, militarism, colonialism, and sovereignty, which are really actually pretty interconnected areas of research. So I think those will be great to continue to further explore and educate and build connections across UCI and of course in the community in Orange County and the vibrant communities in Southern California. So Situs Masi, thank you so much. I'm really grateful for this award and to be a part of it with all of you.
Thank you so much, Professor Naputi. I now want to introduce our final awardee, Professor Carolina Valdivia, who will be joining UCI as assistant professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society in the School of Social Ecology. Professor Valdivia examines the consequences of our increased scrutiny and enforcement efforts in immigration. Professor Valdivia, we're happy to welcome you, and would you share some brief comments today?
Thank you. Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm really looking forward to joining UCI this summer, and I'll be focusing on expanding opportunities for undocumented students, many of whom identify as first generation and low-income students. And so I definitely saw very exciting and strong parallels with today's presentations. So I'm definitely honored and excited to be a part of this work and to continue these discussions at UC Irvine.
Terrific. Welcome. It's been a pleasure to hear from our current and incoming faculty who bring such commitments and accomplishments to their work here at UCI. As I close our session today, I would like to thank again Chancellor Gilman and our awardees for creating this space for learning. Finally, as I wrap up, I want to encourage you all to consider engaging with the Office of Inclusive Excellence. We have a series of programs that are forthcoming. We will host an additional program on May 5th and May 13th to hear about funded projects that are advancing equity in the age of COVID-19. These faculty and staff presentations will provide insights about how funded examinations of the lessons learned from the current pandemic will reshape our research, teaching, learning, and support services at UCI. I also want to encourage you to consider the Inclusive Excellence Certificate Program. with additional modules on anti-Blackness in the United States. Thus far, these courses have engaged over 1,000 UCI members, employees, and students, and provide a safe space for dialogues to explore the national debates that continue to shape our work and learning. I've given you just 2 examples of ways to remain engaged in the important inclusive excellence work at UCI. I close by thanking you for your time and involvement, and I look forward to our continued collaborations and learning together. Thank you so much, and be well.